Hello everyone, welcome to week 2. Sorry for getting this up late. Lost my jump drive and it took me all week to find them. So everything I had was on that jump drive, so I was getting pretty nervous, but I did find it, and I do apologize for getting this up late. But we'll just do the really quick micro lecture. Chapter 2 is a pretty long chapter. We made it through week 1. Congratulations. There's only 15 more weeks to go. So the lesson objectives for Chapter 2, quantify the economic impact of the U.S. livestock industry, describe the role of international trade in livestock and livestock products, overview the international and the domestic for beef, dairy, horse, poultry, sheep, goat, and swine industries. And then there's some other industries too, like aquaculture, bison, stuff like that. So we'll just get started with the U.S. animal industry, just a big overview. So historically, farms in the U.S. Have been highly diversified. So think back to history class where it's like you had 40 acres, so you did crops, you had a dairy cow, you just kind of dabbled in everything because you had to. And then over time, fewer people chose to work in agriculture, and just because of consumer needs, agriculture became very specialized. We talk about that in week 1, and this actually helped productivity meet consumer demand. And then, so moving on to slide 5, we have cash receipts. That's an evaluation of farm cash receipts from the sale of animals and animal products. It provides us with another perspective of the U.S. animal industry. So basically, a cash receipt is just the selling of a product. So you have a steer, you sell it, that's a cash receipt. We can use that data and we can track those cash receipts to get a better perspective of the industry as a whole. And so figure 2.1, it has the total cash receipts for U.S. livestock products, and that's in millions of dollars. So for Missouri, it's at $3,688 million. So we do pretty well. There's a lot of livestock sales that go on in the state. Some of the bigger states though, you have Texas, they're sitting at 11,758 million. California is another big state, 9,820 million. So the livestock industry does make a lot of money. It is a big deal to the U.S. economy. And then commodity prices, these are prices that are partially influenced by prices paid to producers for animals for their products. Prices fluctuate all the time. These price change are influenced primarily by supply and demand. So commodity prices, typically you'll think of those as like a commodities futures, or you're listening to the radio and they're talking lean hogs are up this many cents, live cattle are down this much, corn's up this much, soybeans are down this much. That's that commodity price that they're talking about, and that trades constantly throughout the day, and so that's going to constantly be changing, and you can actually access those through apps. Pretty much anything, you can get those commodity prices. And then figure 2.2a, this just shows the significant economic challenges faced into agricultural producers, and you can see as we get further and further down the road, prices are rising, and so, but they are cyclic. So yes, prices might be up today, and then they might be down again, especially whenever you look at, say, crops, corn, soybeans, stuff like that. Prices usually go down September, October, November, and then they raise Jan, Feb, March. So just like livestock, these prices can kind of go in a pattern. And so there's just a lot of really good charts in this PowerPoint, and you can just kind of read through those, and it's just looking at commodity prices for pretty much everything. There's lambs, broilers, turkeys, milk, wool, and corn like we talked about. So you can even see on that corn in September, October, November, that price kind of dips down, and then getting out into Jan, Feb, March, that price actually starts to raise. So beef cattle. So biological differences in meeting market demand, changes in consumer demand, feed prices, weather, other. So if the price of corn starts to really go down, that's great for the livestock industry because corn is a feed product that they use. If the corn price really starts to go up, that's also going to affect the prices. And then what happens when, an example is put in here, what happens when the price of milk falls and the dairy industry is hurt. Back in roughly 2008, between 2008 and 2010, there was a lot of dairy farms in the state and around the country that were really hurting. Prices were terrible, and that made them sell more of their cattle into the beef market, and so you have dairy that's hurting. They sell into the beef market to try and recuperate some losses, and then what does that do to the beef market? It brings it down as well. And so market demand, basically everything affects prices. And so from a global perspective, cattle most likely, they were domesticated Asia and Europe during the Stone Age. You have Bos indicus, that's humped cattle. Those were developed in tropical regions. And then you have Bos taurus, those were developed in your more temperate zones. So cattle, including the domestic water buffalo, provide food, fiber, fuel, and power to 6.8 billion people around the world. So the U.S. produces the most beef tonnage, and the U.S. has a distinct efficiency production advantage. So we have a great infrastructure here in the United States. Really, whenever we're talking about any commodity, our infrastructure is great. We can raise a product, we can get it on rail, trucks, boats, whatever we need to do to ship it, and we can move the product. The U.S. produces about 20% of the world's beef with only 7% of the cattle. So we are really good at raising up the cattle and exporting them and getting them to consumers. So countries with high cattle populations relative to their human population typically have a high per capita consumption of beef and high export tonnage. So that would be us. We eat a lot of beef, we export a lot of beef. So why are we so productive? The average carcass weight has increased from 579 pounds in 1975 to roughly 776 in 2007. And so basically we can put more weight on an animal, and so we've went up nearly 200 pounds per animal since 1975. Increase in the number of cattle at feedlots, so we're having more feedlots, bigger feedlots, we can handle more cattle. The market age of fed cattle has decreased, so we're not just getting more weight put on these cattle, we're actually getting more weight put on them in less amount of time. This can be due to crossbreeding, so you have what's called hybrid vigor whenever you crossbreed. We'll talk about that later on in the class, but basically crossbreeding has allowed us to have cattle that gain faster. And then more Canadian and Mexican calves are actually imported and fed in the U.S. So they're being born in Mexico, Canada, they're being imported here into the U.S., and they're being fed at a feedlot. Domestic beef industry, the U.S. beef industry is made up of a series of producing, processing, and consuming segments, and they all relate to each other. But they do operate independently. So we have cattle production and cattle feeding, and if you can refer to table 2.7, that's on page 23, that'll be helpful. So beef cattle production, we'll look at the production side right now. You have cow-calf, so that's 32.5 million head. Is kind of what the book says. That's about 68% of the operations have less than 50 cows. So for our family farm, we have less than 50 cows. We're running right at 30, but it's a cow-calf operation. And so we fall in that 68%. And then, however, more than 70% of the beef cow inventory is in operations with more than 100 cows. These can be commercial cow-calf operations, seed stock breeders, specialized cow-calf producers, really any of that. And you can see from that figure 2.6, you can kind of see where Missouri falls kind of in that, just the middle of the United States, north to south. We fall in, we have quite a few head. So those numbers are in 1,000 head. So we have 1.8 million cattle. Texas 3.9. So we're doing pretty good for ourselves compared to, you know, other places, because I mean, if you think about Kansas, which is a little bit lower number than ours, they have a lot of feedlots. Missouri has feedlots, of course, but Kansas has a lot more. So Missouri's doing pretty good for themselves. So another type of beef cattle production is the stocker yearling production, and this is where producers feed cattle for growth prior to them going to the feedlot for finishing. So they're kind of the middleman between them being calves on the cow-calf operation and them actually making it to a feedlot. So this is also a good example of a replacement heifer program, kind of like the Show Me Select. They raise those animals up, and those can go back into the herd. The primary basis of the stocker yearling operation is to market available forage and high roughage feeds such as grass, crop residues, wheat pasture, and silage. So cattle are just basically combines that can get in and harvest grass that humans can't harvest and can't use themselves to be usable food. And then you have we have feedlot cattle production. This is where cattle are fed in pens or fenced areas where harvested feed is brought to them. So this is going to be a specially mixed ration. It's going to have corn, maybe it's some cottonseed hulls. It's just going to have a very balanced diet for them, and it's all brought to them. Most commercial feedlots feed more than 1.7 times their one-time capacity in a given year. And so basically what that means is a cow will a steer, whatever is being slaughtered on that feedlot, they'll only be there about 5 to 6 months before they're rotated out, and so they actually turn over the facility quite often. And then there's beef cattle feeding, and we have two basic types of feeding, and it's all determined on ownership. You have commercial feeders and you have farmer feeders. And so farmer feeder operations, that's usually owned and operated by an individual or a family, and typically that's going to be less than 100 head of cattle on that feedlot. There's one of these down in Cape Girardeau, out towards Dutchtown. There's one, and they have less than 100 head. It's all family owned. And then you have commercial feeders, and these could be individuals or partners that have a feedlot, but that capacity is going to be over 1,000 head of cattle. So 95% of fed cattle are fed on feedlots where the capacity is 1,000 or more. And then you can see the cattle fed by state, and in the previous, this is figure 2.8, and so whenever we talked about how many cattle Missouri had, you know, we were doing a lot better than Kansas, but whenever you look at figure 2.8, we have about 50,000 head of cattle in feedlots. And then in Kansas, that's where they have just a ton. So that's where they really start to shine, is in the feedlot side of everything. And so we are going to take a break, and I'm going to stop this video, and basically the next video will start up, and it'll be the dairy cattle section. The reason why I'm doing this, just so instead of trying to watch an hour and a half long video to find something, you know, related to poultry, I'll try and break these up to where they're kind of breed and animal specific.